Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a solo episode, and I want to discuss, you'll hear it called intermittent fasting, time restricted eating. And I want to talk about this specifically for body composition. We're not going to be talking about this from a mental health perspective, cognition. We're going to strictly go with body comp and layer in a little bit of performance related things there. With that, before I dive into that though, I just want to go over my free body recomp checklist. In this checklist, I go over 10 things you need for body recomp, the importance of focusing on body comp, the two different types of body recomp, and common training splits that I like as well too. All that is going to be found in there. So if you want to go and grab that, it's completely free, and the link to that is in the show notes. So with that out of the way, let's dive into the topic. Like I said, I want to talk about fasting. Again, you'll hear it be called intermittent fasting, or now I believe it's either time restricted eating or time restricted feeding. I can't remember which one is the definition they use now in research, but either way, it doesn't matter. We're going to discuss that, right? So we're not talking these extended fasts for 3+ days. We're strictly talking intermittent fasting, because I think that's the key here is there's multiple ways to fast. You have, like I said, those like really long, prolonged fasts where people will say, hey, I'm doing this for autophagy. Hey, I'm doing this for mental reset. You obviously have religious sort of fasts that people will do. And then there's alternate day fasting, there's 5-2, right? There's so many different forms of this. And again, really, it's just, we're basically taking a period of time where we're not consuming any calories for an extended period of time. But we're strictly going to talk about, again, the one that I feel like people talk about most, and that's intermittent fasting, time restricted eating, where we take a certain amount out of our day and we're not eating. So we have an eating window, right? It's an eating approach where you intentionally eliminate all calorie intake for a set period of time. And keep this in mind. I think this is super important because people tend to forget a lot about this, is that we already do have to fast when we sleep. Unless you're someone that wakes up in the middle of the night and you wake up and you eat for whatever reason, right? Whether you're night sleepwalking or whatever it may be, right? That could potentially happen to some people for sure. But for most people, we're going to fast overnight when we sleep. We're already looking at, hey, most people are going to be fasting for 6 to 8 hours per day. Okay. And again, I think that's just important because a lot of people don't think that they do. So again, we've gone over the different types of fasting, and we're strictly talking about time restricted eating. Intermittent fasting is you hear them called different things. I just don't think it's intermittent fasting anymore. I think they changed that, but everyone still thinks of it as intermittent fasting. And then we discussed, hey, you already are doing some fasting. And again, we're talking specifically body composition changes here with a little bit of performance sprinkled in. All right. So because again, some people will talk about the cognitive benefits of fasting, and I don't really have much information on that. Or do I really? You'll probably find out throughout this that I'm just not a huge fan of extended fasts for most people, right? When we're talking multiple days on end on there. Again, there's obviously going to be some reasons that you may do it, but yeah. All right. So let's talk. So number one here, I'm just basically going to go through this in like a bullet point form of the main topic around my thoughts around it, and then I'll add some things on top of it there. But the first thing is it can help with having a time restricted eating approach can help with fat loss and your overall intake by decreasing time eating. And so I guess I would say it can help with body composition, right? It can help with regulating your caloric intake. A lot of people will use it for fat loss specifically, and that probably is a slightly better way to use it if fat loss was the goal. But that's what it's most common. But we can definitely use it in a maintenance phase where we're building, or even in a phase where we are consuming more calories. And it can be a way to help limit fat gain because you're taking out an entire period of time where you're eating. You can use this really through many different phases. It's probably going to be a little bit harder to do it in a phase where you have to consume a little bit more calories. And we're mostly thinking, hey, it's going to be hard to probably get all your calories in that you need to in a shorter window. And from a digestion standpoint, it could be hard to squeeze all that food in just because it would simply be hard to do that. You're just probably full there. So really shortening that window when we're trying to consume more calories can be more challenging. But when we're trying to fat loss diet, we don't have as many calories to work with. This can be something that could be helpful because you're really cutting out an entire period of time that you're going to be eating. And so with this, though, calories still matter, but cutting out an entire time a day where you eat can definitely help manage overall calorie intake. So it doesn't matter, right? There's not going to be any magic benefit to limiting fat gain, to losing body fat from a fasting approach. It's just going to help you manage your caloric intake for all the reasons I mentioned. They've gone head to head with, I believe, people that do track their calories and people that don't. They eat in this approach. Or sorry, it may be, hey, people just eat regularly and then people do an intermittent fasting approach and they will lose weight in that intermittent fasting approach because it can help them consume less calories, right? But as I've said throughout, no magic fat loss benefit to doing this. You're not going to magically increase your total daily energy expenditure by doing this. But again, managing that caloric intake can be helpful. For the reason I said that, if you're trying to eat more calories to help with muscle gain, the biggest problem with that would be it would be hard to get in all the calories you need to. In turn, that's where it could be helpful from a fat loss perspective. And I just had a client come back on. He worked with me in the past, but he says, hey, I'm doing a time restricted eating approach right now. And just telling myself that I can't eat during this time helps me eat less calories, because otherwise they may just be like, hey, you don't have that rule around it and you may eat. Whereas if it's like, hey, this is a time where I'm not eating, it can be helpful from there. Now, there are some other issues where if you do that, it may not align with what you have going on. So you may have to change it there. But we'll discuss what like a week could potentially look like. All right, so that's point number one. No magic fat loss benefit, just a way to control your caloric intake. Number two is there's likely some overall health benefits from not eating for some period of time out of the day. Okay. And this goes beyond that 6 to 8 hours, because most people, they're going to be eating around the clock. They'll eat when they first get up. So, hey, I'm super hungry, I need to eat. And then they eat all the way up until bed. So their window of not eating is literally just when they're sleeping. And I think that for one, just most people in general, and especially people that are not in great metabolic health, higher body fat levels, getting that, taking some time away from not eating, whether it's anywhere from 10 to 14 hours, I think is going to be beneficial. And I'll talk about that. I think from an overall health perspective and a body comp perspective. So the two biggest health benefits I think you would see from just making sure you're not eating from, you wake up at 6 a.m., you go to bed at 11 p.m. and you're eating literally throughout that entire time, is one, digestion. If you're constantly eating, your gut is constantly working, and that can lead to some issues. So it's probably good to give it a break every once in a while. I think just letting it have that break beyond just 6 to 8 hours can be helpful from a gut health digestion perspective. So that's number one. Number two is that concept of metabolic flexibility that I've talked about. And while I do think it will help with metabolic flexibility, your body being able to switch back and forth between using fat as a fuel source, not burning fat, not losing body fat, but using fat as a fuel source, and using carbohydrates as a fuel source, switching back and forth. Most people, when you're eating around the clock, you don't have great metabolic health. Your body's always using carbohydrates for energy. And again, that's good for certain circumstances, but we don't want to get to that point to where we're always doing that. And if we're always eating from a metabolic flexibility standpoint, we may not be very good at being able to use fat as a fuel source. And the one way this will show up is someone that needs to eat every 2 to 3 hours all the time. And so that comes back to, I think it's good for our body to be able to go a little bit of an extended period of time past that 6 to 8 hour mark without consuming food. And if you can't do that, that's a sign that you probably need to work on that. Yes, there's some other things we can work on in terms of sleep, meal timing, fuel choice, right? Like all those things are going to be important, and it can help with that, right? Because if you're just waking up to start your day and you're eating a very high carbohydrate meal, you're probably going to feel like you need to eat around the clock, right? If you're constantly snacking, grazing. So we could work on that by eating higher protein, having a good mixed meal, more full meals, less snacking. And that could be something that helps you get to that point. But if you are someone that feels like you need to eat around the clock, this is a sign that we need to work on this. And I would want to get you to a point where, hey, you're taking at least 10 to 12 hours without consuming food there. And it's a good skill to teach in today's modern environment, right? We're so used to eating around the clock. Hey, we have a little bit of hunger. Oh crap, I need to eat. And I found that that leads to issues down the line there. And it can make fat loss challenging, because if you feel like you always need to eat, and anytime you get any hunger and you're not okay with any amount of hunger, that's problematic. And so I think this can also be helpful from that standpoint, to get people to be comfortable with that, to be comfortable with being a little bit hungry. Because I do think that's a skill, and it's a lost skill in today's modern environment, because we always have food right around. And so anytime you go back thousands of years ago when we didn't have this food all around, our bodies had to be very good at not taking in food for extended periods of time. And so again, that's just my thought is that our bodies adapted that way. So that's probably something that we need to continue to run and be able to go back and forth on that. So again, the metabolic flexibility thing is a standpoint across the board. I'll talk about in the ending here, I really want people to be able to go 10 to 12 hours at least. So you're looking at, hey, I think across the board, people should have a cutoff of when they eat. And as I go through the rest of these, it will make sense on what that may look like. Hey, what's that time frame that we want to do for overall metabolic health, for body composition? But I think no matter what across the board, trying to go 10 to 12 hours without consuming food straight through is a skill that I want to build people to. And again, if we can't do that's a sign that there's some things that we need to work on there. Like I said, from a meal timing perspective, metabolic flexibility standpoint, it's a sign that there's things that need to be worked on. All right, so just to sum up the first two, again, it's a way to manage your overall caloric intake, no magical fat loss benefit. And I do think, in saying that though, I do think there is some benefits to working up to 10 to 12 hours per day. And as I'll talk later on in this episode, maybe even higher periodically for some people. In saying this, how long we go, so think about the longer. So going longer than say 10 and 12 hours is really going to be dependent on your current body comp and overall stress load. So this is very important here. Your current body fat level, dieting history, training volume, and stress, and your overall stress load are going to determine whether, these extending this fasting beyond that 10 to 12 or longer, if it's going to be helpful or hurtful for you. So if you're someone who's on the leaner side, you've been a chronic dieter, right? So you already restrict, you're very restrictive with your food intake. You have a high stress load on the body, which those do go hand in hand, right? Someone that's trying to maintain a very lean physique, they probably have high activity levels. They probably move a lot, probably train a lot, potentially having that sort of chronic dieter history as well too. They're typically going to have a high stress load on their body in low recovery. So with them, we do want to be careful with extended fasting in those populations. So for these people, I'm not a fan of extended fasting windows regularly, as the key word there being regularly. If you have a really high, like you're an endurance runner, maybe you do some weight training, you do a lot of cardio, you move 25,000 steps a day, you're on the leaner side, you've been a chronic dieter where like your calories are already low, you're always trying to lose more weight. You're someone I would be careful with very long fasting. And the chronic dieter, depending on their body composition, that would be something that we would take into consideration, right? Because some chronic dieters are not necessarily lean. You do have a decent amount of chronic dieters that are not lean. So that's where it would be a case-by-case basis in what's going on there. What I will say is I'm also just less bullish on extended fasting windows for women in general, just due to the stress response of energy deficiency, which extended fasting is a short-term energy deficiency there. However, for overweight men, I think extended fasting windows can be a solid strategy for the right person. And same thing for women too, right? It can be in the right situation, but for most, extended fasting windows, I would be very careful with there. And again, this simply just comes down to women have a higher stress response to energy deficiency being not having enough energy coming in, whether that's short-term energy deficiency or long-term. I do think it can be problematic. Now, obviously, short-term energy deficiency is less problematic than long-term, but there still is that stress response that we have to be careful with, because you take someone that is a leaner female, maybe they've always chronic dieted, they have a high stress load on their body because of those two things. They also do a lot of training. Like for them, I would not do extended fasting. Maybe we're looking at closer to 10 hours, but maybe not to their situations, but probably we at least do 10 to 12 hours, but anything past that definitely wouldn't. But you take a male who's 25% body fat, 30% body fat, like for them, men don't have as large of a stress response to energy deficiency. I would be like, hey, I think an extended fast over 12 hours could be beneficial for you. So we'll talk about that there. But again, women in general, I just would be careful with. We have to take into consideration somebody's current body fat levels and stress load overall, because fasting can be a stressor on the body. So we do have to manage that correctly. But it all comes down to what are the main stressors that are causing a high stress load on the body for that person. So ideally, you're training around the eating window. So nothing's going to zap performance, recovery, and body comp more than training during your fasting window regularly. This is going to really mostly impact the muscle side of the equation, which in turn, if it's impacting the muscle side of the equation, that could impact that will impact our body composition there, and where our weight's coming from if we are in a deficit. Now, what you could potentially do is, I said around the eating window. So for some people, going into your training fasted is okay, depending on when you ate last. But what I would want to be careful with is you're doing an extended fast, and then your training is within that extended fast, right? You don't have food within an hour or two of that training, right? So that's a big thing there. We definitely want to make sure we train around our eating window if we're going to do extended fast, right? And again, I'm talking extended fast over 10 to 12 hours because, like I said, as a baseline, I want to try and work people up to regular 10 to 12 hours on there. But there are a few situations where 10 to 12 hours we would not do, and we'll talk about what that is. Early time restricted eating is likely better. Fasting from say 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. is going to be better than fasting from 12 a.m. to 2 p.m. Okay. So you will see a lot of people that ask, hey, if I just don't eat until 3, is that going to be helpful? There is individual responses to this, individual preferences that we need to take into consideration. Again, somebody's overall metabolic health is going to play a role in this, which I'll talk about in a minute. I'll give 2 examples of that. But in saying that, generally speaking, we want to have this earlier time restricted eating window. We want to probably fast from say 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. for most people here. And then versus that kind of later, hey, I'm not going to eat till 2 and then I'm going to eat up until 12 a.m. And the reason being is this aligns with our natural circadian rhythms better from a blood sugar, digestion, and sleep perspective. Research also shows that hunger is more manageable with this setup too, right? So we're able to regulate our hunger a lot better with this setup than if we're eating later in the day. From a blood sugar standpoint, our body just as the day goes on, it doesn't high amounts of blood sugar as well as it does earlier in the day. So glucose metabolism is impacted. Digestion also gets worse as the day goes on. So if we're hammering a bunch of food in later in the day, that could impact digestion, which is going to have downstream impacts on overall health, body composition, et cetera. And we're also looking at a sleep perspective. here, right? Where the more meals we have later into the day, closer to bed, especially meals that are just like heavier, higher carb, higher fat type meals, they are going to start to impact sleep, which then is going to impact next day. And then that's going to impact your metabolic health. So there's a lot of downstream impacts there by doing that, by impacting our sleep from a meal timing perspective. So this just aligns better with our circadian rhythm to do it, to eat earlier in the day versus as the day goes on. Now, again, overall calories still matter. This later time restricted eating where you eat, where your meals are later in the day can certainly work if you manage your caloric intake. I think it can work better if you have more carbs to start your day. And as the day goes on, you taper your carbs down. But as I said, metabolic health is also going to be important too, right? So someone that is, say, more overweight, they may not have great metabolic health. I think that setup, this later time restricted eating, again, if we can just manage our overall caloric intake, do what I said with the more carbs earlier in the day, it could potentially work. But I think for them, we still want to try to shift more of our food to earlier in the day versus later. A lot of times, but like I said, the digestion is the other big thing too, where now you're trying to cram in a bunch of food from that perspective, and we could potentially be messing with sleep. So you have the metabolically unhealthy person, overweight person. If we are going to do this, I still would opt for earlier in the day, but ideally if we're going to do it that way, hey, more carbs earlier in the day versus later, right? Whereas it's a higher protein, higher fiber type meal as we get later into the day, and still try and cut that last meal off as early as you can, right? But then we run into that issue where now your eating window may only be 6 hours, so it has to make sense for you there. But where I think it could be okay is I was having a conversation with Brian Borstein, which that episode will be out in a couple of weeks, and he was telling me, and I didn't know this about him, he told me that he doesn't eat until 12 p.m. And he stops eating, I think, around 8 to 10, something like that. And so for him, one things he does is he doesn't eat until super late at night. Like he's still cutting it off relatively early. He also is in good metabolic health, right? So he's someone that he eats around his training. His body's just better able to handle the food that he gives it, right? Because he's active, because he's at a healthy body composition, he has a lot of muscle, right? These are things that are going to help with that. Whereas someone that doesn't have those things, I think this is not as good of a setup, but there are some things that we can do to go about it, right? That's the way he eats. He's in good overall health. And so it's, hey, like we can't, there is a personal preference here to this. And again, there's some ways that we can set it up to be a little bit better. But generally speaking, I'm going to shoot for people to do earlier in the day. And again, it just aligns with our natural circadian rhythms a lot better there. So my next point I want to make here on this is longer fasting windows are not better. And if we decide to do longer fasting windows, we need to work up to them. Okay. We don't just want to go from eating around the clock to, oh, hey, you know what? I'm going to do a 24-hour fast. Don't be a hero. That's not going to work. You're just going to make that a very miserable process, and you're probably going to rebound after that. One, I think the highest I would like to go regularly, think more than 5 to 6 days per week, because I'm going to talk about how it doesn't have to be 7 days per week. You do the same thing. You can alter what your fasting window looks like. But to me, for 99% of the people, I don't want it to be more than 14 to 16 hours fasted. One, in the research, like when they show managing calories, like really anything past that 6 to 8 hour feeding window, anything lower than that, there's no extra benefit from doing. If anything, you're going to run into more issues because now you're going to be micronutrient deplete. You're not going to get enough. It's going to be super hard to get in enough protein if you're eating in, say, 4 hours. Again, this is regularly. I think there's nothing wrong with once a week working up to something that is a little bit more extreme, but we have to work our way up to it, right? But the thing being is, I think 14 to 16 hours is what practically works for most people. Going any longer than this isn't inherently better, right? This isn't a competition here. Regardless, you need to work up to it no matter what. So even if you're going up to 16 hours fasted and right now you're eating 8 hours, you're only taking an 8-hour break, we have to work up to that. So it's like maybe the first week you're doing, say you've been eating around the clock, you're going from 8 hours to 10 hours, right? So maybe you're eating from 10 p.m. and then you start eating at 7, right? So what is that? Sorry, that wouldn't be a good one. Let's do, you're eating up until 11 p.m. and you start eating at 6, right? So like right now, hey, you have a 7-hour window where you're not eating. First week, I would stop eating at 9 p.m., keep your breakfast the same, right? Now you've just extended that. So now you're doing, what is that? Almost 10 hours now. So do that for a week, see how you feel. From there, maybe now you're not eating from 8 o'clock. Maybe now it's still 9, but now you're not eating until 8. So now it's 11 hours. You do that for a week and so on and so forth, right? Something like that. But again, in the real world, I just haven't seen these extended out, like the more than 14, 60 hours work for an extended period of time. Again, maybe in the short term and maybe for a few days out of the week, people could do that, but not all the time. And like I said, don't be a hero and go from eating all the time to then trying to do 24 hours there. So my next point is you still need to hit your macros and micros. Another issue with this style of eating is that it leads to people underfeeling from a macro standpoint, right? They're either like low in protein or maybe now they're like super low carb and they don't need to be, but also from a micronutrient standpoint. Now we're just underfueling, and that's going to lead to other issues down the line, long-term from a body comp and health standpoint, right? So we also need to make sure we're still having a good diet quality. I think that's really the lure of this type of eating is it's like oh, hey, you can eat whatever you want and you're good to go. And we still need to focus on these things. Yeah, from a weight perspective, you could totally have one meal a day where you eat whatever you want and you're probably going to be at, say, 1,500 calories. So you'll probably drop some weight that way, but what does it look like? So we still need to make sure we're strategic with what we're eating, and we still need to focus on our diet quality there. All right, my final point here on this is you can cycle longer intermittent fasting days. It doesn't have to be straight across the board. You don't have to do, hey, if you choose 16, you have to do 16 every single day, right? It could literally be something where 4 to 6 days out of the week, you do the 10 to 12 hour fasting windows that we talked about, right? The baseline that I want to get people to. And then 1 to 2 times per week on non-training days, you could work up to a 14 to 16 hour fasting window or even longer potentially, right? If you're a good candidate for it, right? Like you need to be a good candidate for a longer fasting window than 10 to 12 hours, right? Again, you take your very lean person, chronic, who's already low calories, high stress load. Like, again, I'm probably not going to even for one day out of the week go up to 14 to 16 hours. That's just another stressor on their body that we don't need to do. As I said earlier, women particularly would be a population that we would have to have really good reason to go over 14 to 16 hours and even work up to 14 to 16 hours in that situation, right? It would be the situation where I would consider it would be somebody in a building phase that has been in a building phase for a while. Maybe they've put on 10 to 15 pounds in their building phase. They've been consistently hitting maintenance or slightly higher for 6 months or longer. In that situation, maybe we would work up to 1 day per week on a day that they're not training 14 to 16 hours. But someone that is yo-yo dieting, they already are eating during the week and then they overeat during the week and then they feel like their body comp's not changing, like that wouldn't be a person I would do this for there. So it has to be that like consistent extended period of time where they've been eating at maintenance or higher, and we have to take in their body composition. And still, even then, it would be dependent on the person, and we would want to do it not around their training, or at least a hard training day there. But like I said, you need to make sure you're a good candidate for fasting windows longer than 10 to 12 hours. I want to bring it back to those people that I was talking about that I just brought up there with that, right? So even someone that has high training volumes, we have to be super careful with an extended fast. Again, 1 day out of the week, it's less problematic than if you do it all the time, right? So just keep in mind, like you could cycle time restricted eating as well too. It doesn't have to be across the board of, hey, you pick 12 hours, that's the only thing you can do, right? We can change that. All right, so let's sum it up here and where I think and how I like to use this. So again, if we look at things that we want to consider, it can help with fat loss, overall calorie intake by decreasing time eating, but no magical fat loss benefit. And it can be a way to manage your body weight. Likely some overall health benefits from not eating for some period of time regularly. We're looking at that 10 to 12 hours, at least around that 10 to 12 hour mark there. Your current body composition and overall stress load is important. You need to consider that. Ideally, you're training around the eating window. Early time restricted eating is likely better, so we want to shift more of our meals to earlier in the day. Longer fasting windows are not better. And if you do decide to do something longer, you need to work your way up. We still need to hit our macros and micros during that time. And you don't have to choose one, and that's the only setup that you have. You can have days where you can do a day every 2 weeks, a day every 3 weeks, 1 to 2 days a week, where you work up to a longer fast that's 14, 16 plus hours there. That's how what I can sum it up. So it can help manage body comp, but extended fasts longer than say 10 to 12 hours aren't useful or appropriate for everyone. So we need to look at where you're at. As a general baseline, I like to have clients to have a regular 10 to 12 hour break from eating, including sleep, to support digestion and metabolic flexibility, at least for some period of time. Again, ideally we'd be there most of the time, but obviously in some specific avatars, we need to be careful with that, which I'll talk about what those are, the people that do want to be careful with that. But again, as a baseline, I think 10 to 12 hours is that happy medium. And that's going to teach us all the things that I talked about. It's going to improve your metabolic flexibility. It's going to teach you that skill of being somewhat hungry and sitting with that. And it's going to help with digestion, right? And saying this, baseline of 10 to 12 hours, where we want to be careful with that are very high training loads. So like an athlete that is doing a ton of training, an endurance runner, like for them, like they are already so far down that rabbit hole of they wouldn't get a lot of benefit from going a period of time. The only case I could say would be from a digestion standpoint. That would potentially benefit them to give their gut a break. But in those periods that they need to train a lot for whatever, that's probably not the time to really push that fasting all the time. Again, there are exceptions. We need to take everything into consideration, but that is one potential exception. Another very good exception would be during pregnancy. There's no need to go 10 to 12 hours. You obviously need to fuel your body. And there again, I think the play for that person would be better meal timing, better food choices, et cetera, versus trying to go for an extended fast there. And then a history of disordered eating. Like we have to be careful here with them as well too. That kind of comes into that kind of chronic diet or lean body composition person there. But for lean people, chronic dieters, people with high training loads and high stress loads, I don't think fasting longer than say 10 to 12 hours per day regularly is beneficial when we consider muscle fat performance, not just weight. Again, like the situations of fasting would come down to men. I would be more likely to do it, but they need to be higher body weight. Those would be people I would do longer regular fasts with that are extended. Women, again, I'd be more careful. I still would like to have a baseline of 10 to 12 hours, but extended fast for them, generally not going to do it unless, again, it's someone that is very metabolically unhealthy and is at higher body fat. I think pushing them a little bit higher than 10 to 12 hours could be beneficial, but still would want to be careful with it there. And people that then the other person that I would potentially do these extended fasts with would be someone that has been consistently eating at maintenance or a small surplus for an extended period of time. And I think building that into their day would potentially be into their week would be beneficial to do an extended fast every once in a while there. But just remember like that, I think 10 to 12 hours is a good baseline. And whether you go longer than that depends on a lot of things that we need that I went over today, especially when we look at body composition and overall health too. So hopefully this was helpful. Let me know if you guys have any questions on this topic. You can follow me on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_. That's where I'm most active on social media. You can ask me any questions about this episode or in general. I am looking to take on new clients in February. If you are interested in changing your body composition, improving your performance in the gym or out of the gym, maybe you just want to feel better, you want to drop your resting heart rate, you want to improve your recovery, then my one-on-one coaching, my performance recomp method is for you. And so definitely go and check that out. If you have any questions, again, you can reach out on Instagram, but looking to add some new clients. And now is definitely the time to get ahead of any summer goals that you may have or any extended goals that you may have over the next 3, 6, 12 months. And then if you found this podcast be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and a review, and that will help more people find it. Talk to you guys soon.